Now I'm going to speak with Glenn McGillivray, who thinks that as hard as it may be, Rachel has the right idea here. Some people who have been hit time and time again by flooding are just going to have to move. He's the managing director at the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. Glenn, hello.
Hello.
So first of all, what have you been thinking as you've watched the flooding in Ontario and Quebec and New Brunswick this season?
Well, honestly, I've been thinking, here we go again. So for people in Ottawa, Gatineau, Montreal, places like that, it's the second time in 2 years. For people in places like New Brunswick, it's the second time in 1 year.
St. John, New Brunswick has set a new record for its highest ever flood level, and the worst is far from over.
Now there are warnings the water is spreading danger because it's overwhelmed the sewer systems and unleashed contamination.
And I think sometimes we're used to these things happening perhaps every 10 or 15 or 20 years apart, but now it's much closer together.
I know you say here we go again, but what about the idea that some of these floods are record-breaking? In Bracebridge, Ontario, for example, in parts of New Brunswick. The Red Cross is saying that there are some areas that have been hit this year that are being hit for the first time.
Yeah, the first time recently, but not the first time in history. And so you're going to get that. You're going to get places that haven't flooded for a while, but then again, we have these recurring things as well, so it's a little bit of both.
You believe that people who live in these high-risk areas that are prone to flooding, that they should move. Is that right?
I believe so, yes.
But, these are people's homes, so can you see how difficult that is for them?
Oh, absolutely. And, my heart really goes out to these folks. It really does. I don't want to seem callous or cold, but it's pretty clear that what's happening right now is not sustainable, and we have to come up with some permanent solutions. And, rushing in with sandbags and volunteers and other barriers and things like that is needed right now in the near term, but in the long term, we have to come up with some ideas that will put this to bed forever.
Right. So can we talk a little bit about those ideas? How exactly do you see this working, moving people away from these high-risk flood zones?
Yeah, well, we have a few examples in Canada of this happening in the past. In the U.S., however, they have a formal program, and that's one of the things we need here. But in places like the Netherlands, too, where they're absolutely excellent at managing flood, world leaders in managing flood, they've been buying out properties for years as well.
Henk Ovink is a water expert, a special envoy for international water affairs for the Netherlands.
In the Netherlands, we had a program. It was called Room for the River. We almost flooded in 1995 and evacuated 250,000 people, and then thought, the rivers, we forgot about them. So we gave them more room and the capacity to flow.
How did you give them more room?
By moving people out of harm's way.
And you say that it hasn't happened here often, but is there an example of it happening here?
Sure. I go back to actually 1954 in the Toronto area with Hurricane Hazel. Over 80 people died from flooding in the Toronto area.
24 hours after the hurricane and floods had passed, some 300 people were still missing. Countless thousands are homeless.
Homes and properties snatched by surging waters. Lives snuffed out with hardly a moment's notice. Less than an hour ago, I saw the first of 3 automobiles being raised from the onrushing flood waters.
Well, the water was only 2 inches high when I went to the garage. Well, when I come back, the water was up to my waist.
The province came in and bought out homeowners located along the Humber River area and also in another part of Toronto. And those properties were converted into green space and parkland. And that's key. We don't want to see the properties resold. We want them to turn into public green space.
25 years ago today, Hurricane Hazel hit the Toronto region.
Today, Toronto is better prepared. Floodplains have become picnic grounds. Huge dams and reservoirs control water levels.
And then is the idea here that when it floods onto like a park?
Exactly, and there's really no damage, and nobody loses their lives, and you might be inconvenienced for a day or two if you wanted to go to the park, but other than that, there's no permanent impact.
How many people do you think we're talking about here? I know the Quebec Premier François Legault is offering up $200,000 to move homeowners out of homes built on these floodplains.
We really need to have incentives to move the people when it's happening every year or almost.
But how many people? This seems like it would cost a lot of money.
Well, as a lump sum, it'll cost a bit of money at the beginning, but we're paying somehow anyway. We're going to either pay by continuing to offer disaster assistance and continuing to rebuild, We're going to pay with the interruption that it costs, the disruption, the cost of first responders. If we decide to put in flood defenses, levees and things like that, that costs a lot of money and actually locks you into this perpetual state where you're always going to have to maintain and upgrade that infrastructure. So you're going to pay one way or the other, so you have to decide which is the best route to take, and we really think that buyouts are the way to go.
And I just want to get a sense of the scope of these buyouts. I mean, 5,000 people have had to leave their homes in Saint-Mars-sur-le-Lac, a suburb of Montreal. So are we talking about buyouts for tens of thousands of people?
Well, I mean, when you talk about 5,000 people, you divide that amongst homeowners or households. So you're talking far fewer households. But I think the key here is really looking at the really high-risk properties and looking at buyouts for the high-risk properties. Not everybody is high risk, and not everybody is at danger of flooding all the time. But certainly you start with the high-risk properties.
And just to unpack that idea a little bit more, I think something I'm struggling with is how we are able to predict these properties, because I understand that flood maps in Canada aren't particularly up to date or accessible, like essentially that we can't really say all of which areas are prone to flooding. And also, isn't this climate change? As we just spoke about, there are homes that haven't been flooded before, and we've been told that flooding is going to get more intense, more unpredictable. So realistically, how do we know which homes to evacuate?
Right. Well, we don't want to overstate the flood mapping issue too much. Flood maps definitely have to be updated. They have to incorporate new technology. They have to incorporate climate change. It's not to say, though, that the flood experts don't know where the flooding happens. They have a pretty good idea of where it happens. And especially, the high-risk properties are fairly well known. They would be, essentially next to the river, right on the floodway. As far as, climate change will definitely change the footprint of flooding, but it won't necessarily change the footprint of the really high-risk properties. It will, most likely incorporate newer properties into the mix a little bit further from the river, ones that we didn't know, were at risk before we mapped for climate change.
What do you see happening if people in these areas aren't moved, if we just continue on the path that we've been going on?
Well, I mean, if the models are correct, we're going to see more of these events in the years ahead, and we're going to see more property damage and more disruption. And it's not just because of the possible change in the frequency of flooding, but it's also just the increase in development. If you have more in the bullseye, you're going to get more losses. And so this is not just a blip. This is going to happen more and more often in the future. We're going to see more disruption, and it's best to deal with it now because you're going to deal with it at some point.
Glenn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Before we go today, I just want to tell you about a community that's been dealing with this for a long time. For 17 years, the residents of Kashechewan First Nation have been forced to leave their homes as the Albany River floods into their community. This week, First Nation leaders in Ontario went to the legislature to demand the provincial and federal governments hurry up and help the community relocate away from the floodplain, where they were moved by the feds in 1957.
You see, in Ottawa, the response is immediate. They pretty much call in the army to come save everyone. Why is that? First Nations in Kashechewan are Ontarians and Canadians just as much as they are in Ottawa.
That's it for today. I'm Jamie Poisson. Thanks for listening to Front Burner.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts/podcasts/podcasts.